Chapter 7, we're moving into different types of homicides, and in particular here we're talking about confrontational homicides. So this term is coined by Ken Polk in 1994 in his book called When Men Kill, and he's talking about homicides that begin with an altercation, usually a public one, and it's viewed as some sort of type of contest of honor by at least one of the participants. They tend to occur in bars, parties, parking lots, streets, and alleys, and it's also sometimes referred to as an honor contest violence. Participants are often intoxicated or under the influence. Both the offender and victim are often male. So what happens is usually there's some type of incident, some type of altercation that leads to lethal violence. And the reason it leads to that is that the incident is seen as a threat to the reputation of one of the men. So this could be a bump, an insult, a nonverbal challenge. This leads to a verbal exchange. What may happen next is one party may leave the scene to get a weapon, or they may just grab an available object, a bottle, a gun, their fists. And what happens is the exchange escalates very quickly and ends with a homicide. Women make up less than 15% of homicide offenders in any country where such statistics are kept. And so theories that explain confrontational homicide often argue that there's a direct connection here between masculinity and violence. The author did some research, the author of the text, in which he found cases committed by women that could be considered confrontational homicides. There's no official organization that classifies homicides as confrontational, and this can make it difficult to really ascertain just how many homicides fit this category. However, data that is collected, the SHR, NIBRS UCR, does provide some information on the circumstances, and we can use those to estimate which circumstances are likely to be confrontational homicides. Wolfgang's study found that 35%, so a little more than a third of homicides, came from a result of trivial altercations. Polk, in a 1994 study in Victoria, Australia, found 22% of all homicides were confrontational, and this was by far the largest category of offenders in his study. So in his study, in Polk's study, we're basically seeing that this is the most common type of homicide. 2004 UCR data tells us that about 30% of homicides are related to a brawl or argument. Some other circumstances, such as a lover's triangle or a gang killing, some of those may also be confrontational in nature. If you look, you can see that the percent of homicides doesn't change much from year to year. The percent of homicides due to confrontational circumstances. And just look for a minute at the bar graph, because although it looks like it dipped significantly in 2002, notice that the bar graph only ranges over a 2.5 point spread. So these types of homicides, even though the term has only been coined recently, are pretty common throughout history. They often resulted from brawling, dueling, feuds, lynching, and usually they were the end result of a confrontation in which one of the parties honored had been challenged. It was common in the 16th and 17th century for elites to use their swords in situations where they felt their honor was challenged. So from the 15th century until the 19th century, dueling led to many homicides. So Andrew Jackson, our 17th president, shot and killed a man during a duel, and Alexander Hamilton was killed in a duel by Aaron Burr. This still happens today, although we generally don't refer to it as an affront to one's honor. So Colin Morgan, a 24-year-old member of a rap group, was sentenced to 30 years in England for murdering Colin Scarlett. So basically, Morgan killed Scarlett for disrespecting him. And here's what happened. Scarlett was dating Morgan's ex-girlfriend, McFarlane. Morgan and McFarlane fought over McFarlane's relationship with Scarlett. Scarlett gets pissed, beats Morgan as McFarlane stood by. Scarlett fired 7 shots, all of which missed, and Morgan fired 4 shots and hit Scarlett in the neck, chest, and hand. So a lot of times confrontational homicides are part of what we call victim-precipitated homicides. Wolfgang in 1958 found that sometimes the victim initiated the incident that resulted in his or her death. So these are homicides in which the victim was the first to employ physical force against the person who ultimately killed them. So 26% of the 588 homicides Wolfgang studied were victim-precipitated. They were more likely to be male, 90%, versus 70%, and more likely to be black, 80% versus 70%. Women did make up a larger percentage of killers in a victim-precipitated homicide than a non-victim precipitated homicide, and most likely because they were responding to men who initiated violence against them. These men were violent towards women they saw as challenging their masculinity or disrespecting them, and as such, they may be confrontational homicides as well. Homicide can also be seen as a situated transaction, and this idea was put forth by Luckenbill in 1977. And so what he's basically saying is that a lot of times homicide could be the result of a seemingly inconsequential incidents that turn into character contests. So most homicides are the result of a contest in which adversaries interact in a way that at least one of them believed would keep them from looking weak. And they refer to these as situated transactions. If you think about it, this is like saving face. Luckenbill studied police records for 71 homicides in a California county. Most of the homicides occurred when the victim and offender were taking part in leisure activities. So they're partying, watching TV, hanging out. Most occurred on weekends between 6 p.m. and 2 a.m. Nearly half occurred at home, while others occurred at bars and street corners. Over 60% of people were involved were related to each other, or friends, and some were acquaintances. And often there's an audience of onlookers who know either one or both participants. So basically, these homicides follow a pattern involving 6 stages, and the first is the opening move. The victim does something that is viewed as an affront by the offender. 3 common opening moves include an offensive comment, and this occurs in 41% of cases. So for example, 17-year-old Alt stabbed 18-year-old Meyer 16 to 17 times because he was talking trash to him. Another 34% of cases occur when the victim refuses to do what the offender wants. So the offender, in turn, interprets this as a denial of his ability or right to command obedience. So Principal Wicks was stabbed in the groin by his lover, Teresa, during a confrontation over his infidelities. Basically, he would not leave his wife. And nonverbal gestures are about 25% of cases. So Charles became angry when Lemeron took his bandana off his head and hit him with it. He believed he was being insulted, and to make the matters even worse, he was being insulted in front of his girlfriend. The fight then moved to the kitchen, where Charles grabbed a grilling fork. What has to happen next is someone has to interpret that event as an affront to them. And the key point here is the interpretation. The victim may not mean any offense. So in 60% of cases, the victim or other witnesses helped the offender define that as offensive. So someone is there being like, ooh, he did what? The offender then has a choice. They can ignore the insult, or they can make a retaliatory move. Generally, when someone retaliates, they do so to save face. They don't want their reputation ruined. And this looks similar to opening moves. The victim then has to decide to stand up or flee, and if they flee, they may be perceived as weak. Then a working agreement is formed. Both the victim and offender are now committed to battle. A weapon may appear, and one may leave to get it, or it might be something that's readily available. Finally, we have 3 general final moves by the offender. The offender flees the scene, and this is a pretty common move. The offender waits for the police in about a third of cases, and in another 20% of cases, observers involuntarily hold the offender until the police arrive. So what's important here in Luckenbill's work is that the homicide is not often one-sided, right? So he views it as a situated transaction. Each participant has an opportunity, several opportunities to stop the event from progressing, but both, in an attempt to save face, keep moving forward. And the other key part of Luckenbill's proposal is that the audience plays a key role. If the audience is defining the event as offensive and encouraging retaliation. And here's Luckenbill's 6 stages, and we see this with Lemeron's girlfriend. So Felsen in 1982 interviews about 500 people about disputes in which they had taken part. And he found that most interpersonal aggression is a response to some perceived rule violation, and therefore the aggressor feels justified. Men are more likely than women to express their anger when insulted, and this may explain why confrontational homicides are more closely linked to males. If a third party prompts the conflict, the aggression is more severe, particularly when both participants are male. So, for example, a schoolyard fight. If a third party mediates the conflict, it is less likely to escalate. So you can see here that the audience is really important. They have the ability to de-escalate the situation. They have the ability to escalate it as well. So let's think about confrontational homicides and the subculture of violence that we talked about in a prior chapter. Wolfgang found that African Americans were overrepresented as victims and offenders. So in his study, in his birth cohort, they were 18% of Philadelphia's population, but 73% of victims and 75% of offenders. And overwhelmingly, they were young men. So this is why he introduces the idea of a subculture of violence. He argues that most violence is a reaction to some trivial matter. Any young man who doesn't respond with violence or aggression is seen as weak. Wolfgang later writes, about 10 years later with Ferracuti, and argues that there is a subculture of violence amongst lower class males, and that their norms are not completely different from those norms of the dominant culture. But what has happened is they've learned that the proper response to an insult is violence. And if they don't stand up for themselves, then their masculinity is called into question. So basically, violence is not just seen as acceptable, it's expected in certain circumstances. Schiade and Steffensmeiser studied 158 cities in 1994, and they found that inequality in those cities was much greater among African Americans than in other cities. They basically argued that perhaps the higher rates of violence amongst blacks in urban settings is not because of culture, but rather structure, since they suffer from significantly more economic hardship. Velez, Crivo, and Peterson in 2003 found that violence amongst African Americans is more complicated than the subculture of violence. So they looked at what they call a black-white gap in killing. And they looked at data from 135 cities, all which had a population of at least 100,000 people, and a black population of at least 5,000. And what they wanted to do was explore how the social and economic circumstances influenced homicide amongst whites and blacks. And he found that in these cities, African Americans experienced greater structural disadvantage. So violence then is a reflection of advantages that whites have over blacks in the U.S. This is things like higher home ownership, higher education, higher average household income. So when we take a look at this now in terms of the Southern subculture of honor, this could be used to explain violence committed by white Southern men. Rates of homicide and assault have been higher in the South, and as early as 1880, scholars began noting these differences. And here we can just look at some basic data here from the UCR as to how the population is distributed and homicides are distributed across the Northeast, Midwest, South, and Western parts of the U.S. The reason for these differences is contested, though. Some people say it's structural factors, while Nisbet and Cohen argue there's a culture of honor. This culture of honor is pretty similar to what we just spoke about with the subculture of violence. Basically, it requires men to stand up to any affront to their honor. They argued that this is passed down through generations, and that this is because the South is settled by Scott-Irish herdsmen who made their living from their livestock. So because the nature of their culture was that there was always a possibility someone would steal their livestock. They had no police to call, and they had to protect the property themselves. This made them ready to react violently to protect their livelihood. And this came at a great cost to their reputations and livelihood. So thinking about confrontational homicide, is it a man's world? Adler and Polk argue that the challenge to one's manhood is no trivial matter, and perhaps for men in lower socioeconomic status, violence is a way to prove one's masculinity, and it's a way to prove their masculinity that maybe isn't available when other methods available to upper class or upper SES men are available. So the potential for violence amongst women became a focus of the media and the criminologists in the late 1970s. It's the first time a woman appears on the FBI's most wanted list, and we see an increase in the number of women being arrested. Before this, little was written about women as offenders. Adler first proposes masculinity theory in 1975, and she basically was saying that because the women's movement was encouraging and allowing women to be more like men, we should see increases in women's offending. As women become more masculine, they should become more violent. Unfortunately, this theory has no support, though, because women's status in the U.S. has improved, but their involvement in homicide has not increased. The type and quality of homicides committed by them has not increased, and neither has crime increased. Simon in 1975 proposed that where women's offending increased, it was not because they were becoming more masculine, but that because they were gaining access to more opportunities, they were gaining access to both legitimate and illegitimate opportunities. So, for example, as women are gaining employment and they have greater opportunities for crimes like embezzlement and fraud. Criminalists haven't really focused on Simon's predictions. They argued that there would be fewer violent offenses for women, and with greater economic opportunities came more opportunities to escape situations like battered relationships where they had been violent in the past. Women's homicide offending has changed very little. It's decreased steadily from 3.0 per 100,000 in 1976 to 1.2 per 100,000 in 2002. The California Department of Justice tells us that the most common circumstance for women who committed homicides in 2004 was an argument, and for males it was gang-related followed by argument. But you can see 2/3 of these for women are an argument. And so it appears as though quite a bit of homicide is probably confrontational. Argument homicides were further broken down into domestic violence and all others, and a much larger percentage of women's offending is due to domestic violence, over 1/3, compared to men's, which is only 1.5%. The author noted earlier that she had found 3 incidents out of 41 in which she studied committed by women that she thought may be confrontational homicides, and these may be situated transactions. So in 1995, 3 black women, age 18, 19, and 22, were found guilty of murder malice in a drive-by shooting of a 14-year-old black middle school student. The police believed the shooting had been the result of an altercation that began the night before at a pool hall. In 1997, a 19-year-old black woman and a 17-year-old white woman were arrested for killing a 24-year-old black woman. The jury found the 19-year-old defendant who committed the stabbing not guilty because witnesses supported her story that she stabbed the victim to get her to stop beating the 17-year-old woman. Also in 1997, a 31-year-old white woman killed her 47-year-old white male neighbor with her van. They'd been feuding about the property line between their houses. She was found not guilty by reason of insanity. And that wraps up the chapter on confrontational homicides.